Your argument is flawed on many levels, not the least of which is you're trying to impose your own belief on other people, namely atheists, by claiming that atheists have a belief in some system and therefore they have a belief instead of a lack of belief. And I think you just don't understand that, yes, a lack of belief is the same thing as I don't believe. What's the difference? It's just that when you say that you don't believe in something, a lot of people interpret that to mean that you believe something else. And yes, there really is a place where you can have no belief in something. I do not have a belief in God. That does not mean that I believe there is no God. There's two totally different things there. But as for evidence, evidence is something that establishes a claim to have validity. For example, if there's a painting that somebody has painted, you can look at that painting and say, well, somebody painted this. Well, why do we know that? Well, because usually there's a trail. Most painters will sign their paintings. We know that people paint, and usually you can track back to find out who painted it, and if they're still living, you can actually have a conversation with the painter. Now, when you come along with something like a tree, and they say, oh, this is evidence that God exists, how do you attribute the existence of this tree to God when you cannot produce the Creator, when you cannot find a trail back that leads to a Creator, and you cannot find any evidence to support the idea that this thing was created by some intelligence? How do you correlate that to validate that as evidence? You're making a claim that it's not only evidence of God, but that it's evidence, period. All it's evidence of that we know of right now is that it's a tree. We know trees exist. And we can trace back the evolutionary path back to its, ancestors, where it originated. There may be some missing points in between where we haven't found any samples yet that fill in the blanks, but we know from what we know about genetics, the lineage that led up to a tree. Now, where that all originated, nobody really knows. But to claim that an atheist believes in some criteria that your evidence does not meet with them and they just don't agree that it's evidence is flawed, because the evidence doesn't establish itself as evidence. It doesn't become evidence because you say it's evidence. It doesn't become evidence because you want it to be evidence. Just because you believe in God doesn't make this existence of a tree evidence that God exists. You're trying to base a premise on a conclusion, and that doesn't work. That is not evidence, and that is not the scientific method. And I know that probably you think that the scientific method is an atheist's belief that discredits any evidence that you could provide for the existence of God. But the scientific process method exists because it works, at least for the things that we know to exist. We see things, we observe like gravity. We know gravity exists. Well, science is trying to understand how that works. We know evolution exists because we see the end result and we see it happening. We can see it. How does it work? Well, that's what we're trying to understand. We have not seen a God and say, well, how does that work? How does God work? Where's the evidence to support this observation that we've made? So far, nobody has ever observed God. Well, at least nobody that's been validated or verified that this has occurred. Many people have claimed that they've seen something, but nobody has ever been able to establish validity of these claims based on any evidence. So take it or leave it. But you can't base your argument on an atheist having a lack of belief to mean that they believe something else, because that just isn't the case, and you're missing the point. So there you have it from my perspective.